The next time a recession hits, your government will do something that sounds insane. It will spend more at the exact moment it is collecting less. Nobody voted on that. It is simply what governments do now. His name was John Maynard Keynes. In February of 1936, he published a book that changed what a treasury believes its job is, written while his own fund was still climbing out of a hole. Because here is the part the textbook leaves out. In 1930, the endowment Keynes ran fell 32%. The market he was measured against fell 20%. He did worse than the thing he was trying to beat. In the next half hour, you get what he actually argued, not the slogan. Why an economy can sit in a slump for years without fixing itself, and what the multiplier really claims. And you get the fight nobody remembers. In 1944, he walked into a New Hampshire hotel with a plan for the world's money and lost. What beat him is the system you live in. Start with where he came from because it explains the confidence. He was born on the 5th of June, 1883, in Cambridge, England. Not near Cambridge, in it. His father was a university man. His mother would become the town's mayor. He grew up inside the institution that would later employ him. That matters for one reason. Keynes never had to fight his way into the room where decisions were made. He was raised in it, and he spoke to power all his life the way you speak to a colleague. He went to Eton, then to King's College, Cambridge. He read mathematics. Hold on to that, because his opponents later accused him of many things, but never of being unable to follow an argument. And then the First World War arrived, and Keynes went to the Treasury. This is the hinge of his whole life, and it is usually skipped in a sentence. He was not an academic commenting from outside. He spent the war inside the machine that paid for it. He learned what a currency is when it is under strain. He learned what happens when a state needs more than it has. He learned that the numbers in a ledger are decisions somebody made in a room. When the war ended in 1918, he was sent to Paris as a Treasury representative to the peace conference. He was 35 years old. And what he saw there turned a technical civil servant into the most famous economist alive. The question in Paris was simple to ask and impossible to answer. Germany had lost. How much should Germany pay? Keynes did the arithmetic the way a treasury man does. He asked what Germany could actually produce, what it could actually export, and therefore what it could actually transfer to other countries year after year. And he came to a conclusion that made him deeply unpopular in a room full of people who wanted a number that would satisfy their voters. The figures being discussed were not payable, not harsh, not severe. Payable was the wrong category. A country cannot transfer wealth it does not generate, and the treaty was arranging to take more than Germany would produce. He proposed something else, not forgiveness, a fund. Money put in to rebuild European economies on the argument that a functioning Germany was worth more to its creditors than a broken one. It was rejected. And in June of 1919, John Maynard Keynes resigned from the British delegation and went home to write. The book came out that December. It was called The Economic Consequences of the Peace, and it did something economics books do not do. It sold about 100,000 copies in 6 months, and it was translated into 12 languages. Part of that was the argument. Most of it was the writing. Keynes described the men who made the treaty in prose so precise and so cruel that people read it the way you read a novel. And its central claim was a prediction. A peace built on payments that cannot be made will not hold. The bill will be renegotiated or defaulted, or it will be settled some other way. Now, I want to be careful here, because this is where this story usually gets oversimplified. People say Keynes predicted the Second World War. What he actually wrote was narrower, and honestly, more impressive, he said the economic settlement would fail on its own terms, and that a Europe kept poor would not stay stable. He was right about the economics. Nobody can prove the counterfactual about the war. Take the accurate version. It is strong enough. What matters for the rest of tonight is what the book did to him. At 36, Keynes became a public figure who could move opinion by writing an essay. He would use that constantly, and it would eventually be his most powerful tool, and his most dangerous habit. Now we get to the part of Keynes almost nobody teaches, and it is the reason this episode exists. In 1921, King's College, his own college, handed him a pot of money to manage. It was called the chest. This was not a symbolic role. He ran real money in real markets for 25 years, through the 1929 crash, through the Great Depression, and into the Second World War. So we do not have to speculate about whether Keynes could survive contact with a market. There is a record, and the headline of that record is genuinely remarkable. The chest grew from about 30,000 pounds to about 380,000. That is a compounding rate of just over 12% a year. Over the same period, the British stock market fell about 15%. And there is a detail that makes it better. That growth was capital appreciation alone. The dividends were not reinvested. Keynes spent them on the college. The whole return came from the assets going up. So, brilliant investor. Case closed? No. And this is the part I want you to sit with. Look at what happened when the crash came. In 1929, the chest returned 0.8%. The UK market returned 6.6%. He underperformed in the year of the crash. Then 1930, the market fell 20.3%. The chest fell 32.4%. Read that again. In the worst year, the man who was about to explain depressions to the world lost half again, as much as the market he was trying to beat. Now, what would you do? Because there are two honest responses to a drawdown like that, and only one of them is any good. The first is to decide you were unlucky and keep going. The second is to ask whether the method was wrong. Keynes asked the second question, and he changed. In the early years, he had been trading the cycle, trying to read the macro turn and position ahead of it. It is exactly what you would expect from a man who thought about economies for a living. It did not work. The turn is harder to time than the theory suggests, even when the theory is yours. So he moved to something else, a smaller number of companies he had actually studied, held through the noise, chosen for what they were worth rather than for where the cycle was going. And he wrote down what he had learned in a memorandum to the college, in language that is startlingly close to what the best investors say today. Hold a few investments you understand well, rather than many you understand slightly. Buy on the basis of what a business is genuinely worth relative to its price. And hold on steadily through several years until either the thesis works or it is proven wrong. Notice what that last one costs. It means accepting that you will look foolish for extended periods in front of people who can remove you. He was managing his own college's money. The committee was down the corridor. And notice the harder thing underneath it. Every one of those rules is a rule about behavior, not about analysis. He did not decide he had been bad at economics. He decided he had been asking the market to tell him something it does not know. He also did something with the endowment that was close to heresy at the time. He sold property and bought shares, ordinary company equity, until roughly a third of the college's money sat in it. Today that sounds obvious. Then, for an institution that expected to exist for centuries, it looked reckless. The safe thing was land. And that is the shape of the whole man, in one story. He was wrong, expensively, in public. He changed the method and kept the conviction. And the thing he was mocked for became standard practice for endowments everywhere. Hold that in your head for the next act. Because in 1936, he is going to tell the world that markets do not fix themselves, and he had just paid, personally, to find that out. To understand what Keynes wrote, you have to understand what everybody already believed. The economics he was trained in had a comfortable answer to unemployment, and the answer was, it does not last. The logic went like this. If people want jobs and cannot find them, then labor is in surplus. A surplus pushes the price down. The price of labor is wages, so wages fall. And once wages are low enough, hiring somebody becomes worth it again. Employers hire. The surplus clears. The economy returns to full employment. It is a clean argument. It has the shape of a good argument. And in the 1930s, you could walk outside and see that it was not happening. That is the whole intellectual crisis in one sentence. Across the industrial world, millions of people were out of work year after year, and the self-correcting mechanism was simply not correcting. The orthodox reply was that something must be blocking it. Unions holding wages up, governments interfering, remove the obstruction, and the machine resumes. Keynes looked at that and asked a question that turned out to be devastating. What if cutting wages does not fix it? What if cutting wages makes it worse? Here is his argument, and it is the single most useful idea in this episode, so let me build it slowly. Your wage is your income. It is also somebody else's cost. Those are the same numbers seen from two sides. Now cut everybody's wages at once. Every employer's costs fall. Good, but every worker's income falls too, and workers are the people who buy things. So demand falls. Firms sell less. Selling less, they do not need more stuff. They need less. So they cut again. The mechanism that was supposed to clear the surplus can deepen it. The individual logic is sound, and the collective result is a spiral. And that is the piece the classical model was missing. It reasoned about one firm and one worker and then assumed the whole economy behaves like the sum of them. There is a cleaner version of this trap, and it has a name worth carrying out of tonight. The paradox of thrift. Saving is virtuous. If you save more, you are better off. That is simply true for you. Now, have everybody save more at the same time? Every pound saved is a pound not spent, and a pound not spent is income somebody else did not receive. So incomes fall across the economy, and when incomes fall, people cannot save as much as they intended. The attempt to save more, made by everyone at once, produces less saving in total. That is the shape of the whole book in one example. A thing that is prudent for one person is destructive when everyone does it, and no individual is behaving badly at any point. It is also why the country should tighten its belt in a downturn. Sounds like common sense and is the precise opposite of it. A household that cuts spending has more money. A country that cuts spending has less income. Keynes's answer was that it does not. An economy has properties that no single participant has. Total spending is one of them, and nobody in the system is responsible for it. Which leads to the conclusion that made him famous and made him hated. An economy can come to rest, genuinely settle stably for years, at a level where a large number of people are out of work. Not in transition, not on the way back to full employment, just stopped there. A bad equilibrium and nothing inside the system pushing it out. If that is true, then waiting is not a policy. It is a decision to stay where you are. The book came out in February of 1936. He had been drafting and revising for about 6 years. It was called The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. And I should tell you honestly, it is a difficult book. It is not the elegant prose of 1919. It argues with other economists on nearly every page. But the core of it can be stated plainly, and here it is. The level of employment in an economy is set by total spending, not by how hard people are willing to work, and not by how low they are willing to go on wages, by how much is being spent. So if spending falls and stays low, employment falls and stays low, and the question becomes, who spends when everyone else has stopped? Households will not. If you fear for your job, you save. That is not irrational. It is the correct individual response, and it makes the aggregate worse. Firms will not. You invest when you expect customers. In a slump, you expect fewer. So you postpone. Banks cannot force it. You can make borrowing cheap, but cheap credit does not create a reason to build a factory nobody will buy from. Which leaves one actor whose spending does not depend on expecting a profit. The government. That is the argument. Not that the state is wise, not that public spending is better than private, only that in a slump, it is the one participant who can spend when spending is exactly what is missing. Now the second half, and it is the part that gets abused. The multiplier. The formal version was published by a colleague of Keynes at Cambridge, Richard Kahn, in an article in the Economic Journal in June of 1931, 5 years before the general theory. The idea is this: money spent does not stop when it is spent. It becomes somebody's income, and they spend part of it and that becomes somebody else's income. Pay a builder. The builder buys groceries. The grocer pays staff. The staff buys shoes. 1 pound of public spending shows up as more than 1 pound of activity before it fades out. How much more depends entirely on how much of each round gets spent again rather than saved or sent abroad. That fraction is the whole ballgame, and it is not a constant. Which is exactly where the honest version and the political version part company. The honest version says, in a deep slump, with idle workers and idle machines, extra spending can produce meaningfully more than it costs because you are activating capacity that is sitting there doing nothing. The political version says, spending pays for itself, always, therefore spend. Keynes did not say that. His whole argument is conditional on there being slack. Push demand into an economy that is already running flat out and you do not get output. You get inflation. I want to be blunt about this because it is the most common thing people get wrong about him. Keynesian economics is not the claim that deficits are good. It is the claim that the correct policy depends on where you are in the cycle and that it reverses. In the slump, spend. In the boom, pull back, run surpluses, cool it down. Governments across the world adopted the first half enthusiastically and found the second half politically impossible. That is not a flaw in the theory. It is a fact about elections, and it is worth being precise about which one you are criticizing. Now, there are 2 more pieces of the book that people skip, and they are the 2 that explain why the slump does not end on its own. I am going to give you both, because without them, the argument is only half built. The first is about interest rates, and it changed what an interest rate even is. The old view was that the interest rate is the price that balances saving against investment. People save, firms borrow, and the rate moves until the 2 match. Tidy. Keynes said, no. The interest rate is not the price of saving. It is the price of giving up cash. Think about what you are actually choosing when you buy a bond. You are handing over money, the thing that is safe, that you can spend instantly, that cannot fall in value in nominal terms, in exchange for a promise. So the rate is whatever it takes to persuade you to part with the safety of holding cash. He called that preference for holding cash liquidity preference, and the name is exact. Here is why it matters. In a panic, the desire to hold cash goes up for everybody at once. People want safety precisely when the economy needs them to take risk. So the rate that would be required to pull money out of hiding and into a factory rises at the exact moment it needs to fall. The market for capital gives the wrong signal at the worst possible time. And it means a central bank has less power than people assume. You can flood a system with money, and if everybody simply holds it, nothing happens. The money sits. Lending is not created by making it possible, only by making it attractive. The second piece is about how anybody decides to invest at all. And this is the one that is aged the best. An investment is a bet on a future that has not happened. A factory built today earns money for the next 30 years. What are those 30 years worth? The honest answer is that nobody knows. Not roughly, not with a wide error bar. The information required to calculate it does not exist yet. And yet people do build factories. So what is actually happening in that decision? Keynes' answer is one of the most quoted phrases he ever wrote, and unlike the last one, people usually get it right. He said such decisions are driven by animal spirits, a spontaneous urge to action rather than inaction. That is not an insult. It is a description of what has to be true. If the calculation cannot be completed and the decision gets made anyway, then something other than calculation is finishing it. And it explains the thing a purely mathematical model of a slump cannot. Confidence is not a lubricant on the economy, it is a component of it. When the mood turns, the arithmetic does not change. The willingness to act on it does. Investment falls because the future got scarier, not because the numbers got worse. And that is enough on its own to start the spiral we walked through earlier. Put the 2 together, and you have his answer to why depressions last. Everyone wants to hold cash, so money is expensive exactly when it should be cheap. And nobody wants to commit to a future they cannot see, so the spending that would restore confidence is waiting for the confidence it would create. That is a trap, and nothing inside it has an incentive to break it, which is the whole case for something outside it doing so. And while we are correcting things, let us deal with the most misquoted sentence in economics. In the long run, we are all dead. It appears in a book from 1923 called A Tract on Monetary Reform. People quote it as proof that Keynes was reckless, that he did not care about the future, only the next election. Read it in place, and it is the opposite of that. He is criticizing economists who say that in the long run, the system returns to equilibrium, and who therefore feel no obligation to say anything useful about right now. His point is that eventually it sorts itself out is not an answer to someone who is unemployed this year. The long run is real. It is just not where anyone lives. That is not a license for recklessness. It is a demand that a theory be useful on a human timescale. Now the last act of his life, and the one he lost. July 1944. The war in Europe is not over. Delegates from 44 nations travel to a hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to decide how money will work between countries after the fighting stops. Keynes leads the British delegation. He is 61 and his heart is failing. The problem on the table is old and specific, and to see why his answer was radical, you need to understand it properly. When one country sells more than it buys, it runs a surplus. Another country, somewhere, must be running the matching deficit. Those are two sides of one ledger. They cannot exist apart. Now, which of those two is under pressure to fix it? Under the old system, only one. The deficit country runs out of reserves. It must cut spending, raise rates, put its own people out of work until the imbalance closes. The surplus country is under no pressure at all. It is doing well. It simply accumulates. So the entire cost of correcting a shared imbalance falls on the weaker half. And the way that cost gets paid, every time, is unemployment in the country that can least afford it. Keynes proposed to break that asymmetry. His plan was an international clearing union, effectively a bank for central banks, with its own unit of account. He called it the banker. Trade would be settled through the union. Countries would run balances in banker, and here is the radical part: running a large surplus would be penalized, just as running a large deficit was. The creditor would be pushed to spend, or lend, or revalue. Both sides would be made responsible for a problem. Both sides were creating. It is, when you see it, the same idea as the general theory pointed at the whole world. Somebody has to be responsible for total spending, and if nobody is, the adjustment falls on whoever is weakest. And it is worth pausing on how strange that is as a proposal, coming from where it came from. Britain in 1944 was not the creditor. Britain was going to come out of this war owing more money than any nation had ever owed. Keynes knew that better than anyone alive. He was the man negotiating the loans. So he was designing the rules of a system in which his own country would be the debtor. And the rule he fought hardest for was the one that would relieve debtors. You can read that cynically, and plenty of Americans in the room did. Here is the British delegate proposing that creditors should be obliged to help debtors at the precise moment Britain is about to become the largest debtor on earth. But the argument does not stop being correct because it happens to suit the person making it. He had published the same logic in 1919 about German reparations when Britain was the creditor and stood to lose by it. That is the test, and he passes it. There was one country for whom this was completely unacceptable. In 1944, the United States was the greatest creditor the world had ever seen. It was the surplus. Keynes's design meant accepting obligations permanently for being successful. The American negotiator was Harry Dexter White at the U.S. Treasury. And White did not defeat the banker at the conference. He removed it before the conference. The clearing union was taken off the agenda in the preparatory talks. What was adopted instead was White's plan, a stabilization fund with a finite pool of national currencies in gold. Countries in trouble could draw on it on conditions, but the pool was limited and no obligation of any kind fell on the surplus side. Out of that came two institutions you have heard of, the International Monetary Fund and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. What became the World Bank? Keynes negotiated hard, won concessions on scale and on access, and lost the principle. The thing he had come for did not survive. And I want to be fair to White here, because the easy version of this story makes him the villain, and he was not. He was defending a position his country genuinely held, against a plan that would have committed the United States to open-ended obligations no legislature had agreed to. That is what negotiators do. The point is not that the wrong man won. The point is what the world got as a result, a system in which adjustment still runs one way. When you read today about a country forced into austerity to correct a deficit while its surplus trading partners face no equivalent pressure, you are watching the argument Keynes lost in 1944 still running. In March of 1946, the new institutions held their inaugural meetings in Savannah, Georgia. Keynes went as the British delegate. He was exhausted. He had spent the war negotiating, and the negotiations after the war were harder than the war ones because now there was nothing binding the Allies together except interest. Savannah did not go well for him. The arguments were about where the institutions would sit and who would run them, and on both, he was overruled. He traveled home, and on the 21st of April 1946, John Maynard Keynes died at his home in Firle in Sussex. He was 62. He never sat on the board of either institution he had spent 2 years arguing into existence. Here is what I find genuinely moving about the ending, and it is not the deathbed. It is that his last major act was a failure, and the system built by the people who beat him ran, more or less, for a quarter of a century, and delivered the strongest sustained growth the industrial world has ever recorded. He lost the argument, and the thing that replaced his plan worked anyway? For a while. And when it broke down in the 1970s, people went back and looked at what he had proposed and found that his diagnosis of the flaw was the right one. Losing well is a real category. He is the best example of it in this whole series. So what do you actually take away from this? Tonight, that is worth something? 4 things. 1. Learn to tell a demand problem from a supply problem, because the correct response is opposite for each. If people want to buy and there is idle capacity, more spending creates output. If the shortage is in the goods themselves, energy, chips, housing, then more spending creates price rises and nothing else. When you hear a stimulus argued about, ask which situation you are in first. Almost nobody does. 2. Conditional advice becomes unconditional the moment it becomes popular. And 3. From the investor, not the economist. Keynes lost 32% in a single year and did not conclude that he was unlucky. He concluded his method was wrong and changed the method while keeping the conviction. That distinction, was it the process or the outcome, is the most valuable question you can ask after a loss, and most people never separate them. 4. Watch who bears the cost of an adjustment. That was his last argument, and he lost it. When a debt is renegotiated, when a currency is defended, when a deficit is closed, somebody pays, and the design of the system decides who. It is rarely the strongest party, and that is a choice somebody made, not a law of nature. And one last thing, because it is the thread through everything tonight. Keynes was wrong in public repeatedly, wrong on his fund in 1930, overruled at Versailles, beaten at Bretton Woods, overruled again at Savannah. He is not remembered for being right. He is remembered for being the person who asked whether the machine actually behaves the way the model says, and who kept asking after the answer embarrassed him. That is the habit, not the conclusions. Next Friday on The Economists, we stay with the argument, but change sides. Milton Friedman spent his career demonstrating that the man you just met was wrong about the most important part. that governments cannot fine-tune an economy, and that the thing they really control is the money supply. He won that argument comprehensively, and central banks still run on his answer. So the question for next week is the one that follows tonight. If Keynes was right that spending sets employment, why did the world stop listening to him in the 1970s? And who was right? If you got something out of this, follow the channel. That is genuinely the whole thing that keeps these being made. I will see you next Friday.